All right. Good afternoon, guys. How are you guys doing today? Good? My name is Balaji Ganesan, Don Bosco Durai. We're going to be covering some of the aspects we have learned as part of Privacera and as part of previous work we did in Horton and other places. So just quick intro about ours, and then we'll talk about the agenda of the session. We both are committers with Apache Ranger project. Bosco is also a committer with Hawk and Amari. Our history goes back to Horton, and prior, we co-founded a startup called XA Secure, which eventually became Apache Ranger project. Spent a lot of time working with this community and seeing it grow. So what we're going to do today is based on some of the experiences we have seen as part of Privacera, which is a startup we both are working on right now, as well as what we have seen in Horton. We're working with a lot of Fortune 500 companies, running big data and data initiatives. So we'll go through some of the challenges that we are seeing in the market. Wanted to give you our perspective so that you have a heads up on what others are seeing. We'll then go over a little bit about how you can mitigate those challenges. Then we'll do a demo, and then we'll wrap up with questions. Okay? But keep it interactive. All right, so I'll start with this slide because I do start with slide, but every place I go, it's about when we are doing data initiatives, doing more with data, and data is under attack as well. You have more and more hacks happening on the data level, and the cost is quadrupling every 4 years. And it's not just the security hacks, and there's also a compliance cost to it. There's a cost of doing business with data, and the compliance cost is also increasing. If you're following the news in Europe, there is new regulations such as GDPR coming up, which is imposing up to 4% of revenues as penalties. So that's the state of cost of doing business with data we are seeing. But the reality in every environment is we have hybrid data environments. A hybrid data environment means that there is no one single environment running all of data. That's the truth right now. It's going to be there for a while. And most companies who have done data lakes, they also have other systems, whether it's Teradata, whether it's SaaS. I'm increasingly seeing public cloud environments. And so data moves from traditional data stores into data lake, but it's also moving into public cloud environments. And it could be any system on top. It could be Hortonworks, it could be Cloudera, it could be anything running on top of this public cloud. And so we are using an example here of AWS and Redshift and Hortonworks. But the idea here is that data is actually moving between all these spaces. And so within this, there are some security controls that each environment brings in, which is the community and the vendors have done a really good job of building those basics. So if you look at the current Hortonworks environments, the security goes across Kerberos, Ranger, Knox, and each of them are addressing different aspects. So you have the authentication layer through Kerberos, access control through Ranger, perimeter security in Knox, and then encryption has come up. So that addresses the part of the data lake security. And if you go into different environments, so I'm using an example of AWS here. AWS has VPC security groups, which gives you sort of a firewall. Then there is IAM providing access rules at each individual layer within the infrastructure, and there are encryption. So you might see a parallel between the Hortonworks and AWS here, where it addresses authentication, authorization, access control, and encryption, right? That's good. Everything within this environment is protected. But as data moves between one place to the other, it brings up some unique challenges. And so those challenges, some of the challenges I wanted to talk about today, right? One of them being, as you're putting data in, you're increasingly trying to find out, what is in the data, what is risky and what is not. So log data may not be risky, but certain PII information, depending on the geography, depending on the industry, is extra sensitive. It carries a different risk. So knowing that context is really important, right? And then as you give access to the users may move data between one place to the other. It brings up some other unique challenges, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then obviously there are increasing compliance standards that are changing by the day, and legal and contractual obligations. Those present some unique challenges as well, right? So let's deep dive into some of them. Right, so here's a document, right? So when I talk about sensitive data, the sensitive data could be various forms. So it could be PII, PHI. But let's take a document, unstructured document, and dump it into any kind of environments. It could contain different elements, right? And so in this example, there's different levels of elements where there's a credit card number. I mean, some user put it, but usually would not. There's date of birth, there's name, and potentially an address and other aspects. And again, depending on the industry, depending on the geography, you have different risk levels for this, right? If you are in Europe in GDPR, certain aspects of this data is really sensitive from a compliance standpoint. If you're in US, in certain industry, it is sensitive. Certain industry, it's not that regulated as well. So depending on where you are, you have to know what the risk levels are. But understanding this context is really important, right? Understanding the data part. So that's one of the challenges we increasingly see in this data environments, right? The other part is, what are users doing after they're given access? So most systems will collect audit data, right? So we'll collect audit into and store that information. But it's really hard to find out what's happening. So can you guys tell me what's really happened here? What transaction happened? This is just an audit from HDFS and Ranger. Right. So, it's hard for me to tell as well by reading that. What really happened was we did a DisCP from the Hortonworks environment to S3. And it created about 137 log entries. And it's one single transaction, right? So even though we are creating audit trail, if you really want to, in a compliance and regulated environments, you really want to find out whether data has moved out to some other zones or data has moved to some other devices. Just by creating audits and looking at it, it's really hard to find out. There are certain transactions you will run really hard to do that. And so those are presenting other different challenges where you have put controls in, but what is happening behind the scenes is very hard to find out, right? And this is leading into industries where there are so many compliance regulations coming up. You have to map into each one of them. So there are security aspects such as data spills and data breaches that you need to worry about. And so in this case of data movements, I'm really worrying about data exfiltration out. Worrying about somebody moving the data out, which could be potentially going out of the network as well. But if you look from a compliance standpoint, there's GDPR, there's SOX, depending on the healthcare industry, there's HIPAA. All this are impacting having different regulations. So just to summarize those challenges, even though you put in Ranger, Knox, Kerberos, even though you put in AWS, you have IAM and other aspects, there are additional challenges that keep coming up that you have to be cognizant about, okay? So there are certain ways for you to do that and address that, and this is our view of looking at things. And obviously, you can add other layers, and there are suggestions that we will come up with. So first thing is obviously making decisions. We really come to a state where you have to make decisions, intelligent decisions based on the data part. Every data is different, so you cannot treat everything the same. So you have to make decisions based on the content of the data. So here the first step is invest in a discovery solution, invest in understanding discovery and classifying, understanding the context of the data part, and that's first, right? And second part is building controls, and the third part is behavioral monitoring, right? So let's deep dive into that. So discovery is pretty straightforward, but it's not straightforward under the hood. You have to really understand the context, the metadata, other aspects of doing what is sensitive and non-sensitive. It requires a little bit of work to do that part, especially when it comes to unstructured data, like the Word document I talked about. You really need to understand the context of where the data is placed. So you need to start thinking about a little bit of machine learning and NLP on top of that. And obviously, how this information can be externalized and integrated with Atlas or other information will be key as well. So there is some work in the community. You can tap into that. But we would recommend you to start thinking about it. And obviously, it benefits as a first step. Understand what is the level of data, then you make intelligent decisions based on it. Second is controls, right? So once you know what is PII and PHI, start building in controls, right? So in the case of Hortonworks, you can push this into Atlas and start creating Ranger-based, tag-based policies, classification-based policies, which really means that I can have a separate policy for PHI and a separate policy for PII. In the case of AWS, that may not exist, so you'll have to manually translate into policies with IAM and others will do. So again, think about content of the data and create policies based on that. And similarly, identifying sensitive data and anonymizing, encrypting them will be the second step after that part, right? How does it benefit? Obviously, making intelligent decisions. You're not looking at every data the same. You're making intelligent decisions based on the content of the data. And the third is the monitoring, behavior monitoring part, is what happens after you're given access, right? You're looking at behavior of users, stitching together different pieces of information of understanding if the data has moved out, if there is a compliance or potential violations, where you let the users do what they want to do, but have a verification mechanism. Having done that, you will have a trust mechanism. You will have a mechanism where business owners will be willing to put in more data, right? So we'll recommend doing this all steps. What we will do is we'll have a small demo where we cover through some of the aspects that we have, and touches some of the recommendations, and then we'll come back and run through summary and questions, okay?
Yeah, thanks, Balaji. So before I start the demo, let me set the context of it. Like, every enterprise has some global policies. The global policies could be because of your internal security compliance or other security compliance or the compliance about regulations and other things. And then you also are influenced by external requirements. Like if you are in the healthcare, you need PHI compliant. If you are in retail or finance, then you need PCI compliant. And if you are dealing with data from Europe citizenship, then you have to be GDPR compliant. And GDPR compliance goes beyond standard encryption. It talks about consent. It talks about profiling, what data you can use for profiling. It talks about why you are using the data. It also has a much more stronger one called the right to be forgotten. So regardless which industry you are, there will be some level of policies you need to come up with. So in this particular demo, what I've done is I come up with two high-level policy. The policy says that if you are a privileged user, then you can access any sensitive information in your enterprise. But if you're a contractor or an intern, then you can only access certain information, and that also with a limitation around it. Okay? And for the data set, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some custom information, SSN, and credit card. And I have two users. One is Michael, who is a privileged user, and the second is Jennifer, who is a contractor. Since Michael is a privileged user, he can literally access any sensitive data that is in the cluster, regardless if it's in HDFS or Hive, doesn't matter. But if it is Jennifer, who's a contractor, then she cannot access any sensitive data which is in HDFS files. But she can access data in Hive, provided it has been properly masked or anonymized, and there's proper access control around it. Okay? So what I'm going to do is, so I'm going to use a sample data set which contains user information, social security number, and credit card. And I'm going to add this into the cluster. I'm going to use Ambari view for files view for that. So let me go to the place I want to add. Okay. Now I added the sensitive file into the HDFS cluster. Then I'm going to go to the shell script. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cat that file using Michael's login. So as per the requirement, since Michael is a privileged user, you should be able to access everything by default. I'm going to do the same thing with Jennifer. Now, since she is a contractor, technically she should not be able to see the file, so she will get a denied. So I'm going to do the same thing in Hive. And for Hive, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Zeppelin. And I have multiple interpreters out here, and each interpreter is associated with a certain user. And just for the simplicity for this demo, what I did was I created an external table called credit card info, and I mapped to the same folder where I uploaded the data. So in that way, I can directly run the query. So I'm going to run this query as Michael. So I'm going to do a select star. Now, since Michael is a privileged user, you should be able to see everything in that particular table. I'm going to run the same query as Jennifer. Now, the difference between HDFS and Hive is, now she can see the data, but the main difference out here is she can only see the last 4 digits of the SSN, that's as per the policy, and also the credit card number is anonymized. So if you look into the credit card information out here, and what Michael saw was different. Okay? Now, let's take a step back and see what's really going on. If you take an enterprise, generally what happens is you have data stewards, you have data owners, business owners, people who understand the data. They'll go and manually review all the files, and then decide where to put that, which folder, which table. And they're going to manually go and set the policies or permission for the users. Some of them may be eventually transferred into as an ETL process. But as the data lake grows, you start ingesting more data set. And also, there are more users are going to start accessing the cluster. Now, doing this manually is extremely painful and challenging. Now, another problem is, as a data steward, you'll be able to set up the initial policies. You can say, OK, this person has access to, like Michael has access to these folders and tables. But after that, Michael can copy this file or folder to any place he wants to. Or he can take the table, he can transform it, or export to some other folder, and then there could be more users having access to that particular data set, which could mean that there's a vulnerability in the cluster, or you may be also violating some of the compliance. So it's extremely difficult when you try to do this access control using the traditional way. So what you really want to do is you have to do it all automatic so that you associate the policy along with the data, not on the folder or table. Okay? So let's see what's going on behind the scene. So let me start with Pravasara. So in Pravasara, what we do is we are monitoring that everything that is happening is in the cluster. So as soon as any new data set gets added to the cluster, we immediately scan the data, then we tag it, and then appropriately it is all classified. Now, we also have the full visibility of the cluster. We know all the repositories which is in the cluster in the AWS. We know what are the sensitive data which is spread across your environment. So as Balaji mentioned, one of the main things you need to know is you need to know where your sensitive data is. Now, in this particular use case, what I did was I uploaded a file in the HDFS, but I really didn't do any access control around it. So in this case, as soon as the file was uploaded, we scanned it. And since the CSV had both SSN and credit card, there were 2 tags associated with this particular file. And since the table was created from this file, now we also classified the table or the columns. But since they're all columnar now, there's a lot more granularity. The SSN column is now tagged as SSN, and the credit card column is now tagged as PCI. The reason is once you have so much granularity, now you can have different set of policies for different set of data. And if you have Atlas, what happens is we actually propagate these policies into Atlas. Okay. So whatever tags that was discovered in Pravasara automatically gets into Atlas. Now, Atlas becomes your central repository for all your metastore. It includes both the security tags and classification, as well as your business catalog. So in this case, if I'm not wrong, this is the one. Okay, so this is a file that got tagged on Pravasara, got propagated out here. It has both PII and SSN. You can also see the tags from a different way. You can go to tags, click on PCI, then you can see, OK, this is the credit card which is tagged as PCI. Okay? Now, this is the step 1. So what you're doing out here, you are scanning, discovering, and classifying. The next step is control. So if you're using something like Ranger, then Ranger gives a very nice way of setting up some of the policies globally. in this demo, what I've done is I'm using tag-based policies. Those who are not aware of tag-based policies in Ranger, you can actually set up some of these policies at a very global level. That means as any data that is tagged with this classification, the policy will be automatically enforced. So it doesn't really matter where the data is, which table it is. It's more of a global policy. And it has two types of policies. One is access, and second is masking. So access is where you can say who can access the data. So what I've done is anything with this SSN, with any HDFS file which has been tagged as SSN, I've given access to very few people in the enterprise, like Michael and other users. And also, I have explicitly set up a deny condition. So here I'm using Jennifer, but in your case, it could be any contractor group or intern group or any set of users. And I've explicitly said that deny them. So that's why when Michael tried to access the file in HDFS, he could see it, even though we didn't set any explicit policy. While when Jennifer tried to access the same file, she was rejected. And if Michael had moved the file somewhere else, the tag would have followed it, and still no one else could have been able to see the file unless until you have one other person who have been given the access. The second type of policy is the masking policy. So while access does control who can see it, masking is the second level. If you have access to it, the masking policy will decide what to show to the user. In this particular demo, what I've done is I added the same privileged users and gave them unrestricted access to the data. So pretty much any data they're going to be accessed is not going to be masked. While in the case of the rest, I said that the last 4 digits should be only visible. So similarly, for the credit card column also, I've given another policy which says anonymize the data for that particular user, specifically for the public. Okay? So that's why when we ran this query as Jennifer, the last 4 digits of the SSN was shown, but for the credit card, it was anonymized. Okay? So this is the second step, that is control. The third step is monitoring. So most of them who are in enterprise are also, when anyone says monitoring, the first thing that comes is, if I have auditing in my system, I'm good. But they don't realize the main reason for auditing is to see whether you have the right set of policies set in your environment, so you can catch all the anomalies. And also you can use auditing to find if there's any security breaches in your environment. And particularly when it comes to big data and other things, there are billions of audit logs comes in, so it's very important that you really look into what is going on. And another thing about big data and also in the traditional system is some of these privileged users like Michael, they have way too much power. And if someone compromises their account, then pretty much they can steal every information that you have, either it is on-premise or in cloud. So coming back to Privacy, what we do out here is we use machine learning to find out anomaly of how users are accessing the data. And since we have the complete view of the entire environment, including the repositories, we know what sort of data is there, where it is stored, how it has been accessed. So you get one place to see all of them. You can also drill down to any specific users. If I just pick Jennifer, I can see all the applications she accessed. I can also find out all the different sensitive information she accessed in one place. And then there are alerts like excessive denied. I can act upon it. I can go and manually block Jennifer, or you can have Privacy or someone like Privacy go and automatically block this user. Okay. So this covers the third step, that is monitoring and auditing. Okay. So let me do one thing. Let me give it back to Balaji.
Yeah, thanks, Bosco. So just to summarize, and we'll wrap this up and we'll open it up for questions. The cost of doing business with data is increasing. So you guys have to be very cognizant about that the cost in every industry comes from both the potential of data getting lost or data getting hacked, as well as the cost of compliance, and that is increasing by the day. And so there is need to have a holistic perspective wherever your data is to manage that. So while individual repositories like Hadoop and cloud have their own security, you have to think about how when data moves, how to control that. So understanding the data is step one. Putting controls with the content of the data, whether you're putting access control or anonymizing, that is step two. And then following that will be the behavior part of really understanding where data is moving, how are users accessing data, create profiling, create norms, will be step three. And you will, by doing that, you will have a greater visibility and control over the risk part of it and help you expand the initiatives that you're doing. So with this, I'll just wrap up. You can reach us through email if you have questions, but we're about 15 minutes, or 10 plus minutes. We'll open it up for questions. Yeah, sorry, I'll go first and come to you.
So does this complement Ranger? That doesn't take any functionality away from Ranger, right?
Correct.
It complements it.
Correct. The question was, does it complement Ranger? And that's correct. Ranger is an enforcement engine. You have enforcement engine in AWS with IAM, so there will be different enforcement engines. So Privacy sits on top of them as a holistic layer. And so we discover, we'll help control through Ranger, other enforcement engines, and then monitor. Yeah. So Vipin, you had a question?
So related to the earlier question and follow-up kind of. So with this, how do we see the traditional method of doing these things like the governance or the authentication as well as authorization thing? So is it set to kind of replace going forward, or is it set to coexist with the other methods?
Okay, so if I understand the question, you are referring to there are traditional set of governance controls such as authentication, authorization. Does this replace or does it enhance, right? So my point is you have to think about all this in layers. So you really need to start with basic controls. So when I showed the slide about Kerberos and Ranger, that is an important step. When you move data to AWS, if you're using HTTP, you can still use Kerberos Ranger. If you're using native AWS, you need to think about VPC security groups and other IAM aspects. Those are your first basic steps. But once you've done that, then you need to think about the next step. So think about classification, think about governance, managing the data, think about how you can manage the policies. And that's where we come in.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't replace those obviates the need. Unfortunately, Kerberos is still not required in the HTTP environment, but it's a layers. You start thinking about other further steps on top of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to add, that also the paradigm is shifting right now, right? You have data which you could, in database, you could do a grand true, okay, but right now you have a lot more data and data is moving. The way data is used now is different than before. You have AI or IoT, other things coming up, and there's a constant movement of data from one location to another location. So you need to now associate the security with the data. So that's why there's more of a data-centric approach rather than a resource-centric thing.
Sorry, we had a question.
Did you do the tagging beforehand, or is that what the product provides?
So
Yeah, so it's in real time. So as you are adding the thing, we look for any changes that happens in the system, whether it is new files or things get moved within the cluster, then you immediately scan it. If it is moved within the cluster, we can just carry forward the tag, but if it's a new one, then we rescan it and retag it and classify it.
So in this scenario, we tagged it using the product. This was not tagged beforehand.
Yeah, so Atlas and all that, you can also go and manually tag it if you really want to. So.
You move between them,
Sorry.
between clusters. Do you maintain the tag, or?
Yes, so that's the other next part, right? So once you move data, since we are monitoring that movement part of it, we will move the, will maintain that tag. And that's the next, it's a crucial part, that's a great question. Is I think the question was, as you move the data, are you maintaining that tag? And I think that's the very critical part of the movements here, where it's not static. As data moves, we'll update, we'll tag it, because we are discovering constantly. There are ways to detect that this is the same data. There are sometimes it's very hard. Since we're tagging it, we'll label that and we'll store that metadata. So everything, once you're able to tag that, all the policies you have set up for controls automatically takes place. And additional controls, monitoring automatically kicks in. So it's essentially moving security or controls wherever the data is moved. Sorry, a question? Did you have a question? Okay.
There is any failure in moving.
Mm-hmm.
If there is any failure.
Right.
Yeah, so what will be the,
So if your question is if there is a failure in moving, so you're not able to move, or?
They moved it, but the tags didn't get whatever on the system itself is not there.
Okay. So yeah, if the tags did not get propagated, right? So yeah, you can still, there is a way for us to catch from the anomalies and other aspects, whether if there's a violation, if there is a suspected violation, we can still cover that. But it's easier if you're built already controls based on a tag. It's easier if you're able to detect that early on. So I think that's our goal.
And also remember, like, all the systems are independently monitored and discovered and classified. When you do a move, the advantage you get is you're carry forwarding the same thing. So if you tag something here and when you move it gets carried forward. But if for some reason that tag doesn't get carried forward, still it will be discovered and tagged on that environment as well as it is. So it doesn't really, so you still get the same problem. I think that's a question.
The question,
sir.
Yeah, when you restrict access by directory or by table, isn't that sufficient though?
So the question was, if you restrict access by table or directory, is that sufficient enough, right? You want to answer that?
Yeah, so that's where we are saying, right? It's not just about access, it's also what you're presenting. So the combination of multiple things comes in, and also how much you're restricting. So access is just one piece of it, and what data you're accessing is the second, and how much you're accessing it also. And then what is presented. In this particular case, we are giving access to certain tables because we want them to do their job, but we don't want them to expose the critical information. So it's either anonymized or it is the limited amount is shown. So you have to do a combination of that to make sure that you can get.
I think the community is moving to it. I mean, you have to get to the attribute level at some point.
Yeah.
So beyond table. So by tagging the attribute and being able to do that, I think there's some work in the community that's happening, more than if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And there are the Atlas and Ranger committers here as well, so I think they can confirm that. So
Yeah.
whether the work is happening.
I think, the question, yeah.
So you discover tags as data is being streamed, or after the fact that file has landed there, you go read the file?
So the question is the discovery happening as it's streamed or after the file has landed in a repository?
Yeah. No, I think it's going to be implementation dependent, right? Every vendor is going to have their own way of doing it. In our case, we are doing after the fact. The reason is we know that data got added, we immediately go and scan it. If you're in line, you can probably do it. It's depending upon which level you have the control. Like you can, if you take HDFS, every client directly talks with the data node. So unless until you're putting a proxy at that level, you won't be able to do it. Or you have to go through Knox and you have to do some other things. So it's going to be a technology dependent, vendor dependent, and all that.
So there is some work in that you can do it at the Kafka layer, for example. Right? So this is extensible to the Kafka layer as you're streaming data in. But irrespective of the fact, you have to detect and do that part. But the idea is you always keep looking at new ingested data. So in our case, in the HDFS level, we do it after it's been ingested, but we're still discovering that. And if you're able to do that prior, that's good as well. But the idea is to make sure that you have a process to keep looking at newer and newer data.
And also reclassify also, because even if you do it one time, the classification might change.
Okay, thanks. It's cool. And one follow-up question.
Sure.
So to discover the tags, you should be running as some user who has complete access to everything. So you create a Ranger policy for that.
Yeah, so depending on the repository, obviously. So obviously in the Hortonworks environment, there is a Ranger policy that will come in, which is obviously has a control and a governance. So we do have some access to scan through the repository. But we, so we'll have a read access, but we are very strictly controlled ourselves in terms of what we do. It's a system. There's no human doing that part. Yeah. Sorry, you had a question?
What formats are supported
For the discovery?
Yeah, and that's always going to be also vendor dependent. In our case, we support all our format. I uploaded for his use case was a doc file. It's about Excel, PDF, MDB. It doesn't matter. So
you support all structured and unstructured formats.
People do scanning of images and try to OCR and all that. So this is possible.
I'll come to you after this one. Abhay.
About the data discovery, in the case of encryption, is it supposed to be work similarly?
At rest or the attribute level encryption? So
Because most of the data discovery, the tagging, etc., happens once the file is uploaded.
mhm. The at rest means you're talking about it's at the.
Once the data is uploaded, it's encrypted,
Mhm.
and you still have to do the tagging.
Yeah, so essentially, like if it is encrypted outside, obviously you can't decrypt it, right? But it's all going to come down how the scanner is implemented and what capability it has. If it can decrypt, it will decrypt it, tag it, and not re-encrypt it, right? So it's all going to be how the
In the
implementation.
HDFS encryption, we are agnostic, right? So if you are encrypted at HDFS layer, we are a layer above. We are reading and writing as any other user. So it really depends on which layer. You are encrypted at the attribute level, like format preserving encryption, obviously, we will not be able to discover that.
But in the case of like KMS,
Mhm. Yeah, so in the case of TDE, we are an authorized user in HDFS. So we are reading and we're reading actually files as an authorized user. As an authorized user, we'll have an access to the key as well. So that is like any other user, but if you're done at a higher level,
Outside the
then,
cluster?
like outside the cluster, if you have anonymized the attributes, for that is not a PII for us. So we'll treat this as a non-PII data.
I think that's
Sorry,
the
you
question.
will come question.
So, yeah, looking at it purely as a DLP solution,
Yeah, so it is a combination of a DLP and a monitoring
so
solution.
if you're looking at the DLP solution, so for a given set of data, if you want to actually look at how was it used, can we actually get a audit report or whatever it is on a periodic basis? So not necessarily it's classified as a PII. On a regular basis, data could change.
Correct.
On a,
You get metrics. So most customers, they look at metrics in the discovery and classification of how many attributes, how much is discovered. So you get that analytics in our dashboard, but you can export that as a report purely on the discovery piece of it. So you'll get you can schedule this as a reporting thing that you can be done. But we go beyond DLP in terms of doing behavior analysis and analytics. So that's why it's a combination of a DLP and a behavioral monitoring solution, but looking purely from a sensitive data across repositories.
I think
Sorry,
there's a
Selva,
question.
you have a question.
So most of your discovery, if you can actually land it in a staging area and do that, then staging area could be something that you can actually secure it only for your process.
Correct.
Yeah,
Is
we
that
could.
something that is vendor dependent kind of thing?
No, I think it's going to be depending upon how.
Repeat the question.
Not vendor. Okay, repeat the question is if it is. If the discovery is done and lands in a staging environment, from that point onwards, you restrict it to only regular users. Yeah, you could definitely do it, right? The places that you need more access is sometimes, like we do a map ready job and you're doing some transformation, you cannot get it from log. This disk copy, you cannot get it from audit logs because you don't even know. So you have to go and look into application logs. So those are the places you get into trouble. Any other questions?
Absolutely.
So when you did the tag on SSN and then you
Mm.
masked it, if I've got that in multiple feeds, multiple different data sets, and I apply a hash to it as my mask,
Mm-hmm.
does it apply the same hash to all of them? So then I can join them down the road?
If it's tagged the same, it will apply the same.
Yeah.
So this is a policy at the tag level, so it's not specific to a data set, so you're not classifying a table or a column. So you're doing it at a data set or doing it at a classification level, which is how we would recommend you to start thinking about. So anything which is applied the same tag will have the same policy.
Just to add that, right, some of these features are done by the community. So this particular feature is done by the combination of the Ranger team and the Hive team. So they work together on the hashing and everything. So you can specify your own hashing algorithm and it will be the same. Okay, I think we're almost done. Okay, so we'll be outside. If you have any questions, feel free to.
But thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.